To record today. I forgot last Wednesday, so if anyone is dying to go over our not final coverage, our continuation of communism and post-communism that we had last Wednesday, sorry. I'll record today so that we will have that moving forward. I try to remember. It's not always the easiest thing to get everything clicked right when I'm doing these presentations. So how's everyone doing today? Good. A few thumbs up from those of you on camera. Nice to see it. We will be jumping into Russia today. How's everyone feeling about Russia right now? Big fan.
I feel like everything we talk about could change literally tomorrow or even in the middle of the class.
Absolutely could. Probably not. Okay, yeah, it could. Like Russia is such a fascinating case. This is the, this is me personally. This is not the textbook. This is not the professor side. It's such a fascinating case to watch Russia do what Russia does. Especially considering the history. We always, something that I think you may have noticed, but I try to cover, and we'll delve a little bit more into, especially as we go on in the semester. But you can't understand any country on the planet without understanding its history first, right? Like, especially when we're looking at, we started off with the United States and the United Kingdom, kind of two easy countries to start with, because the United States really evolved out of, a very set structure that the UK had established. And that established precedent, even though we've seen major changes, like, obviously King Henry VIII was a very different king than King Charles III. We've seen major changes to the way that the monarchy in the UK exists, the amount of power it has, the amount of power it shares with Parliament and everything like that. But we're still talking about systems that have existed and have been fairly stable for hundreds of years. And the United States is in and of itself an interesting case because it has one of the oldest true constitutions in existence. The fact that the United States has only really altered its constitution a total of 17 times. I'm saying 17 because I don't count the Bill of Rights, because I mean, the Bill of Rights, yes, counts as the first 10 amendments, but the fact that they were all passed simultaneously doesn't show that it needed that procedural piece of, proposal, widespread acceptance, and ratification by the processes that the United States sets out for how it changes its constitution. So the fact that, in 200 and however many 40 something, I think, years, the fact that the United States has changed its constitution only 17 times is incredibly stable. It's also partially problematic, right? Because there are a lot of things, I think we could all sit here and think of things that are problematic with the United States Constitution, or problems that arise from the implementation of the Constitution that should probably be changed, but we can't. It's an extremely difficult process to go through to actually adopt a constitutional amendment. And so we see this, sitting in this perspective of starting off with these very stable, very long-lasting democracies, and then looking at the alternatives. I do start with the more familiar and kind of move less and less familiar for a lot of students. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions to that. If you happen to have lived in India for, 6 months of your life, or, 5 years of your life, cool, you're going to be much more familiar with India than most people in the United States. But as we start to move that, further and further afield, we usually start with the ends of the spectrum. And Russia, as a country that is now semi-communistic, post-communistic, the fall of the USSR has given rise to Russia as it is now, and Russia has long wanted to and is attempting to achieve something of that reestablishment of the USSR, as opposed to the Russian Federation as it exists today. And we see those changes being implemented. We see sudden surprise movements that have basis in history but seem to come out of nowhere. Something like the invasion of Ukraine. We political scientists could well predict that Russia was going to invade the Ukraine at some point, but it's always that at some point that gives us that room for surprise, as to the exact time that Russia was going to do it. Did not seem either advantageous or very well selected. We knew that it was a desire of Russia and that Russia would do it eventually, but then when it actually happened, it seemed a bit too apropos. And now, we see this ongoing war in the Ukraine that is the result of that, that is, being mired by, Russia's inability to do what they intended to do and, fully basically annexing the Ukraine, but also, this extremely strong resistance, this resilience that the Ukraine has shown in pushing off Russia's attacks, and revealing, I think, the hubris that Russia had in those actions. Now, all of that might seem, unfair to Russia. It might sound like I'm just dunking on Russia. I'm not. These are things we have to consider when we're looking at the present mode that we understand Russia to exist in, and the way that it interacts with other countries is derivative of its form of government, the structure that that government has. The structure that that government has is the result of decades of history, decades of a constitution originally written in 1991, revised significantly in 1993, and then fairly stable for almost 30 years, but revised again significantly in at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And we will talk about that and why, that revision to the Constitution has so significantly impacted the way that we view Russia today. Those changes, though, that seems fairly quick, even though we're talking about decades. All of those, the way that those constitutional changes have happened, the type of constitution that Russia implemented in the early 1990s, all of those things are also the result of hundreds of years of Russian history, and understanding where the Russian people came from, what they wanted to avoid in the creation of that constitution out of its previous regimes. And the reason that Russia is one of the largest the largest federation on the planet. All of these things are essential to understanding that question of where Russia came from and why Russia is the way it is now. Yeah, Rowan.
What exactly is a federation as opposed to like a republic or, all the other different types of countries?
Absolutely. Excellent question. Federation is it's a term that we use to describe how sub-governments interact. So a federalist system, like we see in the United States and we see in the UK, has very centralized power in the federal government, right? So even though the states exist as sub-governments, and these states have different degrees of power in different areas, there are a lot of things that states are allowed or expressly given the power to oversee within the states, right here in the United States. So, you know, water law is something that almost exclusively exists at the state level. And so those interactions between states express themselves. However, we do have this, you know, centralized government that is overseeing all of those sub-governments, this federalist system. We could delve into the different forms of federalism. Don't worry about that too much. Just understanding that there is a very strong central government that that takes the responsibility for more than just coordination. The federal government can overrule the laws of individual states, right? If something is found to be unconstitutional, if there is a law at the federal level that overrides a law at the state level, it wins in the grand scheme of things. We have a principle in the Constitution, you know, that is the supremacy clause. The supreme law of the land overrules any of the laws of those sub-governments. In a federation, the ideal is that that is not the case. The ideal is that the strongest unit of power will be that more decentralized state type of government. So in the United States, if we were to be a federation as opposed to the centralized federal republic that we are, that would mean that those laws that the federal government writes should not overwrite the laws of the individual states. If you, I'm trying to put this in context. If you think of this in terms of just a specific law on carbon emissions, okay? So if the federal government in the United States writes a law that says you cannot have more than, you know, 100 ppm carbon emission in your production facility. So, you know, they set that level as, you know, 100, you can't have more than that. If a state law comes along and says, you know, you can't have more than 120 ppm in your carbon emissions, that state law is overruled by the federal law. Some, you know, a company can't come along in that state, put out, you know, 110 ppm and say that they're fine because the state law said 120, the federal law said 100. If that is the case, federal law wins out, and that is the rule that they go by. In a federation, that would not necessarily be the case. The federation model means that that law that the individual state puts out, even if it is part of that confederacy, it will take more than that to overrule that law at the federal level. Federal laws should not be written to overrule what an individual state says. Instead, those states should contribute to that federation in such a way that, you know, it's almost more like something, you know, like if you think of the United States' participation in the United Nations, where we will contribute to the United Nations, you know, we contribute forces to a central defense force, but we do not participate in the same way as we will allow the United Nations to overrule the laws of the United States. So the Russian Federation is supposed to function in that way. It is supposed to be a more diffuse system that has power spread out among the individual states, as opposed to being fully centralized in the Russian government. As to how much of a federation the Russia still is, that's something.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's just basically whatever Putin says is what happens. So it doesn't really seem like it's much of a federation anymore,
Sure.
at least From what I can see, I don't know, I could be wrong.
Yeah, and obviously I wasn't going to get through today without mentioning Vladimir Putin. That would be a challenge I would never set to myself in a class where we start talking about Russia. Yeah, we're going to have to talk about the effect that Vladimir Putin has had on the Constitution of Russia, the effect of the Federation. There are still Federation aspects that are implemented in Russia. And it is mostly to do with economic policy and some social policy. The reason that we see so much of, Vladimir Putin's face in anything we talk about with Russia is because the military under Putin has become highly federalized. Russia, under its constitution, is able to implement drafts. It's able to call, not ask, it is able to draft individuals from the different states to join the military when necessary, when the federal government deems it necessary. And for military purposes, the states cannot object to that. They cannot resist something like the draft under the Federation's constitution. So we see a lot, and it's important to note that the things we do see tend to be more in that militaristic, the president's role. And we'll talk about the organization of Russia and how the president and prime minister interact as a facet that kind of helps us determine the answer to that question as to what a federation is supposed to be and what that federation really looks like when it comes to Russia. That's kind of the goal of the next 2 days. So it's a great question to start off with, Rowan. Reese, I saw your hand as well.
Sorry. What's the deal with, I believe, if I remember correctly, Russia has a bunch of these constituent republics. And that's terminology that was used in the USSR, but if I remember correctly, these republics are only within Russia. And does that kind of play into the Federation? I'm not exactly sure how those lines were drawn or what purpose they were meant to serve, but I've always found them interesting. And also, what's the deal with the Commonwealth of Independent States, if I'm remembering the name correctly? I believe Russia kind of founded that over the US, or after the USSR broke up, and it served different roles over time.
Sure. So another aspect of this federation versus federal system that you'll see is that very often in federal systems, the sub-governments will mirror the federal government. So in the instance of the United States, we see that, and I should stop using the United States. It's not the only example that I can give of this in the world. Germany. Cool. Germany, great example of this. We'll talk about this later in class, but Germany has a strong centralized federal government, but each of the individual Landen has their own sub-government. They have their own parliament. They have executives. It may be mayors, it may be governors, it may be those different types of positions. But you do see a reflection of that federal system and that federal structure of distinct branches that exists. And so to be part of that federal government, your sub-government looks very similar to what that federal government is. Makes it easier for organization, makes it easier for for that trickle down. I don't like using that because Reagan kind of ruined that when he applied it to economics, but that trickle down effect of government policy, when you have that at the federal government and it is supposed to be diffused to the state governments, that's a lot easier when you know that the state government systems are structured the same way as that federal government system. In federations, that is not as much of a requirement. In fact, it's, generally considered, other than some of Russia's attempt to now unify and make all of the states consistent in their structure. One of the benefits of a federation is that the individual states, the individual members, don't have to have the same structure as that federal government does. So in Russia, the federal government has this very strongly communistic looking government system. It has representation. It has a central executive branch that is or is not headed by the president, depending on which version of the Constitution you read and how you translate the Russian. But you have this strong federal government that is systemically very communist, but the individual states don't have to mimic that. They can be semi-democratic republics. They can be fully democratic republics. There are actually a couple of democratic republics in the Federation that have maintained a very strong identity of, local elections being democratic. They can also be completely communist in structure. And so if you look across the federations, there are states that hit each of those points along the spectrum. So it is one of the sort of the benefits to joining a federation is that independent control and the ideal of independent designation of what you want your government to look like. That was, to give you another point here of comparison, that was one of the benefits that states saw in wanting to join the Confederacy before the Civil War, right? There were, among others, that self-determination as far as the ability to put into effect slavery policy or, the maintenance of slavery in a state. That was a very strong reason behind the Civil War. But one of the benefits that the Confederacy offered states in joining it was saying, you will have self-determination over your type of government. The independent states were a group of states that basically broke off and simultaneously got their independence when the USSR fell, because the former USSR didn't have enough power to do anything about it. So those are a block of states that essentially have their independence, are self-determined at this point, and have been since, the late 1990s under fairly constant threat of, potentially being reinvaded by Russia, because Russia just wants the USSR back. I mean, if you want a simple driving force of what Vladimir Putin wants to do, he wants to cement his legacy by reestablishing the USSR, by overseeing the entirety of what the USSR used to be, at least in land, if not in governmental control as well. And the Federation is the easiest way for Putin to pursue that. The maintenance of the Federation model for now. Yeah.
Didn't Putin like 10 years ago say something to the effect of like when the USSR broke up and like the 30 or so states that seceded, he was like, yeah, that was like the worst geographic crisis to ever happen to Russia of all time or something to that effect. And basically everyone was like, what you mean? And then, we're seeing what he means now. He's invaded Ukraine, he's invaded Georgia, he's meddling in Azerbaijan and everything. And so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah. And he is using the justification in it. If you listen to what is being said and what is being broadcast on, RT, you see this core argument between what is a state and what is a nation. So it is a good example to, harken back to some of the things we've discussed already in this class. You see that type of language being used. You see this reunification message of Putin says he is trying to reunite the Russian people, whether they identify as Russian or not. That is the goal of this, effort, is to basically take again what was the USSR, reunite that under the banner of all of those people being Russian. That does obviously ignore the histories of areas that have not been part of Russia for very long. Something like the Ukraine has an extensive history in and of itself that is separate from Russia. But there are areas that are very strongly ethnically Russian. And so that argument carries weight. And that's why we saw, the annexation of Crimea several years ago, 2016, I believe was when that happened. We saw the 2014, thank you. We saw the annexation of Crimea that fed into that, because Crimea was one of the strongest ethnically Russian areas in the Ukraine. And we didn't see this international backlash until we saw the invasion of a larger portion of the Ukraine, where that Russian ethnic identity wasn't necessarily the most prominent, where we saw it become a clash of nations, not just a clash of countries and their borders. So yes, it gets extremely complicated, but it does, I think help some of this make sense. Reese, yeah.
You mentioned Putin wanting to restore the USSR. Do you think that includes the communist ideology and imagery, structure of government, all that stuff? But more a Russian Federation that includes everything that was part of the USSR under a Russian government. Yeah.
The functional side. And I think that is something that is specific to Putin's leadership style. If another prime minister eventually if another president eventually takes Putin's place, and by that I mean when Vladimir Putin dies, we may see something like that change. We may see a shift in those goals. But Vladimir Putin has crafted the Russian government to be so centralized around him as president that his goals are the government's goals now. And so when we look at that personality that Vladimir Putin has, his goals are not idealistic. Vladimir Putin supports communism insofar as he supports Russia. But that communism is not necessarily central to his definition of Russia. His definition of Russia seems to be anything Russian. If that is communism, excellent, that's fine. That is part of the Russian identity. If that's not, if that were to come into conflict with the strengthening of the Russian state, then no, that's not a central aspect that Putin would necessarily pursue. I think we saw that even more strongly during his first term as president than we necessarily see now. During his first term as president, some of his major implementations of policy dealt with international trade and essentially an adjustment of the Russian economy to be able to interact better with capitalistic economies. So the Russian government became semi-capitalistic, even if the country and the people of Russia were still, widely under this communistic type of economy. And we even see that to this day, where we see the expressions of communism in the interactions between government and corporations, as opposed to a fully communistic system. And so when we talk about post-communism, that's really what we're talking about in effect. The effect is that companies are still self-owned, by and large, a little bit different in China. We'll talk about that when we get there. But for the most part, companies can function on their own. They can be self-owned, self-determined, but in order to operate in communistic countries, they have more extensive ties with the government, whether that be financially, whether that be through policy, or even directly having members of government sit on their boards. That is how something like McDonald's is able to open shops in Russia. It is by that interaction, by that, the subcontracting of Russia building the places, building the actual building that the McDonald's would function in, and thus having essentially control over any individual store, as opposed to the way that McDonald's functions in the United States, where McDonald's may own the building that it's building a McDonald's in. It's those little tiny things like that that really differentiate Russia and the way that Russia is proceeding forward from other countries around the world. Okay, I am going to go ahead and share. Good, I just glanced and I am still recording, so that's nice. I'm glad that I remembered to do that this time. I do have just a few slides for things around this topic to talk on, but I like the question system. I want you to continue asking these questions as we discuss Russia and how these things look. We kind of touched on this, but I want to go a little bit more directly. We talk about the democratic regimes of the world. We talk about the communist and the post-communist, but there's also this broader system that we are talking in of, non-democratic regimes. And I have to bring that up just because that's how your book labels it, is that there are other ways of structuring government. So to give an example of how this can happen, is asking the question, could the United States become non-democratic? Or I guess more to the point, is the United States already non-democratic in certain ways? This is in reference to a book, and I pulled it just so you could see the cover of it. Robert Dahl, who is a professor at, I guess my screen's really small. Sorry. You don't need to read this. I don't think it's a very good book. I'll put it in the chat anyway, just for the reference. But Robert Dahl wrote a book. Robert Dahl is a scholar from Princeton. He wrote a book, and it's kind of the cornerstone of his career. So I guess I shouldn't say that it's not a very good book, because that feels mean. But he wrote a book called How Democratic is the American Constitution? Just off of that title, what are your thoughts? How democratic is the United States?
I think we're pretty democratic, but just like there's no good system or no perfect system of governance, there's also no 100% democracy.
Absolutely. What percentage would you put us at?
I'll probably say 85, 80 to 85.
Okay. I don't have an answer for this. I'm just curious,
And part of it's like a global perception. So it's like we're the most, or we're some of the most democratic, like in comparison to everyone else. That kind of skews perceptions. Like there are a lot of non-democratic clauses when it comes to stuff like the executive and the judicial. I probably pin it a little lower, like a 65, 70, because of the amount of power that like some Supreme Courts have, or executive administrations or cabinet members that might have some association with the public election but are not directly elected themselves.
Sure. Yeah, very important in that, Jean-Luc, I think, to point out the fact that we have one branch plus, well, no, we have one branch that's directly elected. And so, if you direct election is not the only way to define democracy, but it is a way of looking at how democratic the Constitution is. This is something that Robert Dahl does, cover, I think, all right in his book. Having one branch that is directly elected would say, well, okay, out of 3 branches, then does that mean that the United States is only 33% democratic? I don't, think that that's a good way to measure. That's not, an effective way of saying that the United States is not democratic. But it's certainly something to take into consideration, especially under the original Constitution, where half of that one branch, or the Senate, was also not directly elected. Under the original Constitution, the only body that's directly elected by the people is the House of Representatives. And so, that's a fairly small portion power-wise of the US Constitution that is democratic in that direct election kind of way. So it's a question to consider. Another way that I threw on here that I wanted to talk about the concept of democracy is how you change the Constitution. And this is, the one that I want to specifically tie into our discussion of Russia today. In the United States, there are 2 paths to amending the Constitution. One of them we have used, go back, thank you. One of them we have used 17 times to amend the Constitution. That is that a constitutional amendment is introduced in Congress. It takes 2/3 of a vote in both houses of Congress for an amendment to pass, and then 3/4 of the states have to then ratify that constitutional amendment. A pretty straightforward process. The other process is that a two-thirds of the states can call a constitutional convention. We've never done that under the US Constitution, because the last time that we did that was when we did it under the Articles of Confederation to try to fix the Articles of Confederation. And instead of fixing the Articles of Confederation, they just ended up writing the Constitution. They realized that there were so many problems with the Articles of Confederation that the necessity was just to rewrite the entire thing wholesale and create a new government. So you can imagine there's some fear, maybe, among political scientists that if we called another constitutional convention, the most likely result is that we would see this just overriding of the current Constitution. That there are so many problems under our current constitutional system that if we called it, we would probably just see a new Constitution written. And it's important to note that that's what happens in most other democracies. So to Reese's point from a minute ago that, the US is kind of held up very often as the, kind of model of democracy, or I'm sorry, this may have been Jean-Luc's point, that it was held up as the model of democracy. We don't do the same thing that a lot of other democratic countries do, which is that you can rewrite the Constitution. I've given a couple of examples here, countries that we'll examine later. In Japan, it takes a 2/3 vote to amend the Constitution. And so that, in a referendum among the people, you can change the Constitution or rewrite a new Constitution just by a simple majority amongst the people in Japan. In Germany, you see a supermajority coalition that does the same thing in 1933. because of that, under the new system in Germany, there is not a dedicated way to rewrite the entire constitution at once. They have prevented that from becoming a possibility and made the amendment process just a little bit more accessible to the system in Germany. Yeah, Reese.
If memory serves me right, I think there was one time in the US that Constitutional Convention was used post Articles of Confederation with prohibition. I think that was passed through state conventions instead of the traditional legislature process, I think.
Look that up for me, because I will not, I'm not going to say no. Because if that is the case, however, I don't believe that I've ever heard that of being the case. I believe that prohibition was still initiated in Congress. So let us know if you do come across that, though, if that was the case. So we have systems in place in democratic countries that try to create either a smooth transition from one constitution to another, or something of an accessible system to changing the constitution. What is the fear in democracies about making it too easy to change the constitution? Why would that be something that democracies are afraid to let happen?
It would upset stability.
How so?
You don't know what the government is going to look like the next time a new government is put into power, like a new president or new prime minister. You could be operating under completely different rules between administrations.
And is that bad?
I guess it would, just that it would, in a sense, be less stable because things are constantly changing.
Yeah. And I will say, yes, that would be bad. If every single president that came in did that, if the entirety of the United States government changed in form every 8 years, that would be horrifying. If a president had the ability to do that, and that kind of centralized change would be awful. I say that as a bureaucrat, as someone who has worked in administration. When you work for government administrations, the highest level position changes, right? The department, the secretary, department heads, those often change with administration. The rest of the structure stays pretty stable, but even that one person changing at the top means that administration to administration, you get different goals that are passed down. This is, extremely easy to see if you just hold up President Obama next to President Trump. Their goals as administrations were often diametrically opposed. You would see such radical shifts in the direction of organizations, bureaus, departments under President Trump that it almost seemed like President Trump just wanted to do whatever Obama didn't do. And so to think of that changing that radically, not just in the functioning of departments, but in the entire United States Constitution, sounds scary, and it probably should. That stability is something that the country relies on. And so these countries, parliamentary systems that allow for more frequent changes in the Constitution, they have still safeguards in place to ensure that kind of continuity of government, that continuation of this stability. In the United States, we have just made it significantly harder to change the Constitution to try to guarantee that same stability. So then what do we see when that is not the case? Well, The answer is that we see, no, not that. The answer is that we see Russia. Russia has a system constitutionally that in some ways looks very similar to one of these European parliamentary systems. The State Duma is the representative body. The Federation Council is created. Oh, and sorry. Okay, so the 21st, so Reese pulled up the 21st Amendment, which is the repeal of prohibition, was passed by state convention. So one effective use without it being, you know, an overturn of the US Constitution, but one effective use of state convention to turn over sorry, I just lost all my words. One effective use of a state convention to overturn a previous constitutional amendment. And so, you know, I think that still fits within the context of calling a generalized state convention does still present a very horrifying, let's try to fix all of this, we can't fix all of this, let's write a new constitution kind of plan. But important to note that in one instance where it was used for a specific purpose, that was an effective use of that other method. Cool. Thank you, Reese, for pulling that up. So in this Russian system, we see, you know, the vestiges here, I think, of what looks like a fairly typical system under a parliament. It has a prime minister, it has a president, it has an elected representative body, it has a federation body as well in the Federation Council. Members of the Federation Council are selected by the state regional governments. So we see this, you know, veneer of a system that looks very parliamentary. But the issue with this system is that it did not have those same safeguards in place to ensure continuity in the instance of a rewriting of this constitution. So in 2020, after Vladimir Putin had served the terms that were designated under the Constitution of Russia, after he had served his maximum sequential number of terms as president, he didn't want to leave office. So what does he do? He asked both the prime minister and all of his secretaries, the entire cabinet, to resign so that there was no appropriate way for a constitutional amendment to be fully verified. Instead, it left the president with the temporary power to write constitutional amendments, which Vladimir Putin did, asked the Duma and the Federation Council, many of whom had been appointed by President Putin himself, asked them to ratify all of these constitutional amendments that he proposed, and rewrote it so that he could continue to be president ad infinitum. He also now is individually responsible. So the president of Russia is responsible for appointing the ministers and the prime minister. So as you can imagine, if you are appointed by President Putin, your likelihood of wanting to overturn any of his decisions, or in fact to depose the president at all, are fairly minimal. And so we have a situation in which those safeguards were not put in place. And because of that, Russia has been able to successfully move away from what limited amount of democratic federation it was at a federal level, to the point where now President Putin is the center of this power structure. And Russia no longer really fits the bill of being a true federation because of that centralized power that Putin has now implemented. Does that make sense a little bit for how Russia kind of got to why Putin is just synonymous with Russia now in international media? Okay, cool. We will continue talking about this on Wednesday. I want to just put it on your radar real quick before we close up. In a couple of weeks, on the 24th, I believe, I'm having surgery, just found out, so we will not be having class that day. Hopefully having class on Wednesday. Might see if I can have a guest speaker or something to help cover that day, but just be aware that in a couple weeks there'll be a day where we don't have at least one class. I'll let you know about that in writing in advance and everything as well, but that'll be coming up in a couple weeks, and otherwise I think we're pretty good on the schedule as it is written. So cool. Goodbye.
Thank
Lee.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks. We'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.